Good to have you here this morning. As Nathan said, we're going to be starting a new series today, and it's six sessions. And the first 3 will be in the spring. The last 3 will take place in the fall. And we're talking about, just to keep the momentum going, doing something through the summer. It's a little different that I think would be very important for us as men, especially in light of what's going on today in our culture. But again, today we're going to start God's Story, Your Story, subtitled Becoming the Man or the Character That You Were Designed to Be in the Biggest or the Greatest Story Ever Told. So that's our focus. But as we begin, I have a question. The question is this: why a series on story? I mean, there's so much going on in our culture today, so much going on in the world. Why focus on story? I mean, you know, when we were little, we had stories read to us, and when we were young, we might have read different stories, but you know, you kind of grow up and there are more important things to deal with, like 401ks and, you know, everything like that. Why a series on story? Well, 3 reasons, and this is by way of introduction. First of all, why a series on story? Because life is a story. Life is a story. Life is not an accumulation of random, meaningless events. It's just kind of all out there. Rather, life is a series of unfolding, interconnected scenes. When you think about life, it's not just a bunch of chaotic events. When you think about life, life is something that has scenes that are all interconnected, that have a message, that tell a story. This means that life comes to us, it presents itself to you and me, not as a problem to be figured out, but rather as a narrative to be lived into. That's what life is. It's a narrative to be lived into. Eugene Peterson says this: we live in a narrative. We live in story. Existence has a story shape to it. We have a beginning and an end. We have a plot, and we are characters. What's he saying? He's saying this: life is a story. Life is a story. Second reason we're going to focus on story is because story is how we relate to each other. Story is how you and I relate to each other. For example, when you got here this morning, maybe there was somebody that you haven't seen in a while, and so you said, "Hey, how you been?" Or maybe it was, "Hey, what's up?" Or, "How'd you do?" You know, you were going to do this, "How'd you do?" Did you have a nice time? What happened? What are these? What are these?
Questions.
They're questions, but not just questions, they're called story prompts. What's a story prompt? A story prompt does what? It invites the telling of a story. "Hey, how you been? Tell me a story. How'd you do? Tell me the story of what you did." Story is how we relate to each other. Which means then, for example, why is it so frustrating when you ask a friend, "Hey, how'd you do?" and they get you the answer, "Fine." Or especially this is frustrating when you ask your kids that, right, guys? How'd you do today? "Fine." "How'd you do on the test?" "Fine." "What'd you think?" "Good." It's frustrating. Why? Because we are looking for what? A story. We want a story. Why? Because story is how we relate to each other. John Calvin and Martin Luther, 2 great theologians of the Protestant Reformation, they used a term called homo narrans. You heard of Homo sapien? Man is wise. Homo narrans means man is a storyteller. Man is a storyteller. Man is a storytelling creature. Why? Because we are made in the image of a storytelling God. And so life is about story. We relate to each other as story. Third reason we're going to do a series on stories, because story is how we make sense of things. Story is how we make sense of things. We give meaning to things by unconsciously connecting the dots of our experience. Everything we do, we unconsciously connect the things. So they're not just random happenings. When you connect the dots, you see something, don't you? And what you see forms a message. By connecting the dots, we form internal stories that shape how we see things, how we feel about things, how we act, and how we respond to things. For example, 9/11. How we connect the dots about 9/11 forms the story we tell about ourselves. Lots of dots. This happened, these things all happened, and as a result, boom, 9/11, the two planes hit the Twin Towers. Well, if you connect the dots one way, the story that you tell yourself is that 9/11 is the result of America's oppressive imperial power. That's one story. It's one way people have seen this. Why? Because they've connected the dots in a certain way that, as a result, that's the story that comes out. Or another way of connecting the dots is it formed a story that 9/11 was the result of Islam's hatred of America's freedom. Another way people have connected the dots of all the events that took place that led up to this was it's the result of governmental or Jewish conspiracy. But however you connect the dots and whatever message that comes out as a result of connecting the dots, it is going to always shape our emotions and actions that follow. Let me illustrate this a little bit more. For those of you who are married, or for those of you that aren't, maybe you have a girlfriend or a friend. But let's just say that you're married and you go home today and you get home and your wife is quiet. I mean, more so than usual. In fact, you kind of look in, and when she looks at you, she just kind of turns her head and you see maybe a little tear going down her cheek. So you see that, that's the event. Now all of a sudden you think about everything that happened before you left and everything that happened yesterday and maybe a couple of days before, and you begin to form a story, don't you? You connect the dots and you form a story. And you tell yourself the story, I must have done something wrong. Why? Because that explains her quietness and her tears. Now when you tell yourself that story, I did something wrong, then you begin to feel something. What do you begin to feel, guys? Guilt, shame, pressure, anger, fear, a whole lot of things. And when you begin to feel pressure, anger, fear, shame, guilt, whatever you might feel, what do you then do? Those feelings create a reaction. And that reaction is maybe you try to fix it. I did something wrong. You withdraw. She doesn't appreciate what a good husband she has. Or you attack her. I can never do anything right. And whatever it is. But my point is this. When we connect dots in a certain way, it'll form a story, and that story will always affect how we feel and how we act and how we react. And so why a series on story? Well, life is all about story. Story is how we relate to each other, and story is how we make sense of things. But this is not just a story about your story. This is a series that includes God's story. Why God's story? Well, two general reasons. First, we see in the Bible, throughout the Bible, but especially Genesis 1 through 3, God is writing a good story in which we are important characters. God has formed us and made us and placed us into this world in which He has a story going, and we have an important part to play. We're not the main character, but we are important characters in God's story. And what we realize as we read the scriptures is that God's story explains reality. How things work and why things are the way they are and how life works and why life is the way it is. That's what you learn in Genesis 1 through 3. And the rest of the Bible is the unfolding of that story, what God is up to. His purpose and the plot is the rest of the scriptures. Second, we need to focus on God's story is because if God is writing a good story in which we are important characters, then to deny or ignore that story is foolish. In fact, Psalms 14 verse 1 exactly says that. It says, the fool says in his heart, what? There is no God. And if there is no God, then there is no story, larger story. And so for us to deny or ignore the story is foolish. To deny God's story is to deny reality. Because God's story defines reality, and to deny the story, to ignore God's story, is to deny or ignore reality. And as Dallas Willard says, I love what he says, pain is what you feel when you bump into reality. You can't bend reality. You can only go along with it. To go against it is going to create problems, no matter who you are. So then why a series on story? Well, all of life is about story. It's how we relate. It's how we function. And secondly, God is writing a larger story that defines reality, and it includes us. So that's why we're going to be doing a series on story. So if we're doing a series on story, what's the purpose of the series that's going to be on story? The purpose of the series is this: to help us become the men that God created us to be in the greatest story ever told. God has made us as male image bearers. He's given us a stewardship of power. And that stewardship of power is to be used on His behalf as we align ourselves with His story. That's what God has made us to. And what we want to do then is help you become that man in God's story. And when we become that man, we live in line with reality and we make a difference in this world. Now this series is going to have a threefold focus. God's story, your story. And first of all, we're going to help you understand God's story. You hear a lot about that. Story of God, God's story, the larger story, the bigger story. But what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about God's story? We're going to help you understand that. Second, we hear a lot about your story. We're going to help you understand what that is, and to help you especially to become aware of your story. But then thirdly, we want you to not only understand God's story and become aware of your story, we want to then help you begin to live into God's story, to take your story and move your smaller story into God's larger story, so that you see everything in your smaller story in the context of God's larger story. When we see our lives in the context of God's larger story, it's going to affect how you see yourself as a man, how you view the world around you, how you react to life, and how you think what the purpose of life is. That's why it's so important to do so. The outline of the series, two-part, God's story. The first session, history is God's story. That's what we're going to look at today. Second, how God tells a story. Third, the story that God is telling. And then we're going to have a break for the summer. We're going to figure out we're going to do something else during the summer, but in the fall we're going to pick up how your story was formed. Not all stories are created equal. And then thirdly, living into God's story. So we'll take what we've learned in the first section and begin to apply it to your story in the second section. Okay? Any questions? Well, if not, let's begin with session 1, history is God's story. And we want to address this first session with 3 questions. First, what is God's story? Just to give a general understanding of what it is. We'll get into that, the third section specifically. Second, who is its author? Is it a story about God, or is it a story that God is writing? Third, where is God's story being told? Is it being told in the Bible, or is it told somewhere else?
Bible.
So with those three questions, let's look at the first one. What is God's story? Now, when we ask this question, there are some different ways that we can begin to think about it, just in beginning to understand what we're talking about. First of all, one way to think about God's story is this. It's the story about God's interaction with His creation. It's a story that explains or that looks at God as He interacts with you and me and everything else that He's created. That's one way to think about God's story. Another way to think about God's story is this. It's the single account that explains why life is the way it is. Now, this really flies in the face of postmodernism today. Postmodernism says there's no one universal account that explains everything. In fact, you make up your own story to explain your life and life around you. The idea that there's a single account that explains life everywhere at all times the way it is offensive, but this is the reality. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about God's story. Okay? Thirdly, another way to think about God's story, it's the universal narrative that describes what is true about God, what is true about all people everywhere at all times, and what is true about the world in which we inhabit, the world in which we live. Okay? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about God's story. Dr. Barry Jones, a former prof of mine, my advisor when I did my dissertation, great guy, he wrote this. The story of God is His seen and unseen movement in this world, by which He providentially is orchestrating all of human history towards the day when the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of our Lord. That's how he defines God's story. How I would define God's story for our series, how we're going to look at it, is this. God's story is an overarching narrative. It's an umbrella over all things. Woven into all 66 books of the Bible, begins in Genesis 1, it's told throughout the Bible all the way through Revelation 22. And it explains how a loving Creator is sovereignly directing the entire course of human events in His good but broken creation to do what? To bring forth a glorious future day when all things will once again be made right through Jesus, the world's true Lord and Israel's promised Messiah. Now, those two last phrases that describe Jesus are really important to God's story. The world's true Lord and Israel's promised Messiah. And we'll see that in our third session, why that is important, okay? But notice, this definition, it gives us a single account that explains reality. It is centered in the God of the Bible. It's about God's interaction with mankind and creation. And it involves promises, God's promises, and God's progression towards a future restoration when all things will be made right again. Okay? That's the essence of God's story, what we're talking about. Just a note here, God's story, as we've defined it here, provides 4 essentials that every human being needs to thrive. In other words, if you are going to have a story in which to live, God's story, it's going to need these 4 things, and God's story provides all 4. First, for human beings to survive, we need a fixed foundation for our identity, beliefs, and convictions and actions. We need to have a settled sense of our identity that never changes, with the circumstances or the events of life. I always know who I am. I always know what I believe. My convictions are the same, and it's always going to inform my actions. God's story gives us that. Second, we need a transcendent purpose for our life, relationships, opportunities, work, and possessions. God's story gives us that. It's about something bigger than us. And so we see our possessions in light of something bigger than us. We see the work that we do in light of something bigger than us. If our purpose is only derived by ourselves, our own small self, and it's not about anything than us, then our life and our relationships, our opportunities, work, possessions, you name it, are always going to be self-focused, narcissistic, and never really satisfying. Because we need to be about something bigger than us. God's story provides that, a transcendent purpose. Third, it gives us genuine meaning for all our experiences, both good and bad. You know, something happens, a terrible tragedy happens, and what are we constantly doing? What question are we asking? Why? 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 Why are we doing that? We're trying to make sense of something that makes no sense. God's story gives us meaning. That while we may not specifically understand why this had to happen now at this point or this way, in the bigger picture of things, we have a sense that there is genuine meaning, that this just isn't some arbitrary accident. That somehow, in some way, there's true meaning behind it. And if there's meaning behind it, then there can be something good that comes from it. Without meaning, tragedy has no good to it. When there is meaning in God's bigger story, then even though it is tragic and it hurts, there can still be good meaning that allows us to have comfort in that. And then lastly, when there's meaning and there's purpose and there's foundation, then there's the possibility of having real hope for a good future. You know, we looked at this whole thing of social justice and critical theory and all of that over the last, 4, 6 weeks or months, in our last series, the Chaos series. And one of the things that we saw is that they don't have a fixed foundation, they don't have transcendent purpose, they don't have any genuine meaning, and therefore they don't have any hope, and really all they live in is a sense of a cyclical cynicism. Everything is just power and oppression, power and oppression, liberation, power and oppression, liberation. There's never no hope, and all they do then is live with a sense of cynicism. God's story provides us with a sense of true hope. Why? Because it has genuine meaning, it offers transcendent purpose, and it's all built on a fixed foundation. Okay? So, that's God's story. Second question, who is the author of God's story? G.K. Chesterton said this, "I had always felt life is first a story, and if life is a story, then there is a storyteller." Our question this morning, and point number 2, is this: who is the storyteller? We get a clue in a couple passages. First passage I want us to take a brief look at is Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1, the very first book in the Bible, begins how? In the beginning. What is in the beginning? In the beginning, what is that phrase? You're looking forward. Focus on the phrase. In the beginning is a story prompt. It's going to tell us what? There's a story coming. Get ready. And here is the story. God created. I want you to notice a couple things. First of all, God is doing the action here. If this is part of the story, if this is the beginning of the story, and God is acting in the story, what does that tell us? God's the main character. The story begins with the main character doing the acting. He, God, is creating. But God is not only the main character, He is the author. He is acting, and now He's going to, throughout His entire scriptures, His revealed word to man, He is going to tell us why He's acting, the purpose for His actions, the plot, where it's going, how He is forming it, and where it's ultimately going to end up. He's the main character, and He is the author, but notice also, and this is really important that we can never forget, God is also, tells us here, the creator of everything. He acts in the story, He writes the story, but without Him, there would be no story, there would be no context in which the story could take place. He is the creator of everything. And it's in this creation that God comes and He writes a story in which He is the main character. We are part of that story. We're not the main character. We're important characters. But the story is not about us. The story is about who? God. In other words, Genesis 1:1 says, let me tell you a story. And this story is about God. He's the main character. And it's being told by God. He is the author. And it's dependent on God, completely dependent on God. He is the creator of everything. Second passage that gives us a clue as to who the author of the story is. It's Acts 17, verses 24 through 25. Well, we're going to go beyond that, but for this first slide here, it says this. He, God, is the God who made the world and everything in it. And by the way, Paul here is speaking to the philosophers in Athens on Mars Hill. And so he's responding. Remember they had the statue of the unknown God. And he's saying, let me tell you about the unknown God. You're looking for one. Here's the one that you've missed. He, this unknown God, is the God who made the world and everything in it. What's he saying? He's the creator. And since He is king of heaven and earth, and because He's the creator, He's also what? He's the king. He's the king. He has complete authority over it. He doesn't live in a man-made temples, and human hands can't serve His needs, for He has no needs. He Himself gives life and breath to everything, and He satisfies every need. He has no needs, but everything else He made has needs, and He's the one that supplies those needs. Why? He's the creator and He's the king. Acts 17, 26 through 28, he goes on. From one man, now he's beginning to tell the story, isn't he? Where's the one man? Genesis 1 and 2. From one man, He created all the nations throughout the whole earth. You see that? Genesis 3 through 11 and onward. He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, and He determined their boundaries. He's talking about the nations. His purpose was for the nations, and He did this, His purpose was for the nations to seek after Him and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him, though He is not far from any one of us. In other words, He's here. This author, this creator, this main character is not distant. He's right here amongst us. For in Him we live and move and have our being. I want you to note three things about God as the author creator. First, from Acts 17 we learn that as the author creator, God is separate from and independent of His story. Acts 17 says, as creator, the creator, God depends on nothing and nobody for His existence or life, right? It said that, right? Therefore, as the author of the story, God writes His story not from personal need or outside influence. God doesn't need to write this story because He's lonely. God isn't obligated to write it in a certain way because He owes favors to anybody. God is independent of any outside influence. And therefore, he writes what he wants, the way he wants, and how he wants. Okay? Second thing we learn about the author-creator, and that's this. As the author and creator, God determines the story's purpose while directing its plot to fulfill his purpose. In other words, he's going to write this story, and it has a purpose. It's moving towards a good end, and as God moves it towards a good end, he is the one who is directing its plot all the way to that good end. Acts 17 says, everything in creation needs and is dependent on God as the creator for its existence, its purpose, and meaning, which then that means, as the author, every character, which is everybody that's ever lived, including you and me, every event in God's story, every event that's ever taken place in human history, past, present, and future, will always align with God's purpose and conform to his plot. It always will. Which then means that no event can threaten God's story, no person can obligate or intimidate God in what he's writing. And if that's the case, then God needs no contingency plans. There's no need for plan B because plan A is always going to work. Why? Because as the author, God is the sovereign creator of everything. And everything bows to him, whether it realizes it or not. Third, as author-creator, God has total say over the characters and the plot of his story. Acts 17 says, God, as the creator, establishes all human power. He raises up nations, tears them down, determines their boundaries, and directs all human history to advance his purposes. Therefore, as the author, God alone determines the rise and fall of all nations and rulers. He's the one that sets up presidents and brings down presidents. He's the one that sets up dictators and brings down dictators. Nations rise and fall, not because of their own ambition or power or because of chance or happenstance. God raises nations. That also means that God alone directs all world events and outcomes. Human power doesn't direct it, and neither does chance. God does. Why? Because behind everything is the story of God. It began in Genesis 1 and continues all the way through Revelation 22, when the kingdoms of this earth once again become the kingdoms of our God. And Jesus, the world's true Lord, will reign forever and ever. That's where God's story is going. And nothing can thwart that. And so, who is the author of God's story? Again, important. He's the creator of everything, which means he's independent of his story. He's not shaped by his story. Second, he determines the story's purpose. He's not threatened by any challenges or surprised by anything that comes his way. He directs the story's plot. He's not reacted to unexpected things. He doesn't get reactive to unexpected, what am I going to do? What's plan B? There is no plan B, only plan A. Why? Because God is the creator of everything, and he is the author of the story that we're looking at. So, what does all this then mean for your story and my story? Let's think about this for a minute. Because God is the creator, and again, that's so important to remember, everything belongs to him, including you and including me, right? We're part of creation. If everything in creation belongs to him, then we belong to him. We are not our own. In fact, he says that in Corinthians, we have been bought with a price. Therefore, our purpose in life is to give God glory, to live into his story, which brings him glory. So everything belongs to him, including you. Now, because everything belongs to him, Romans 9:17 through 19 tells us that God is free to do whatever he wants to do with you and me. He's free. Why? We belong to him. Why do we belong to him? Because we're part of creation and he's the creator. Third, Romans 11:36 tells us that because he is free to do whatever he wants, God can write whatever story he wants to write for your life. He can do it. Why? Because he's free to do whatever he wants, because everything belongs to him, and everything belongs to him, including you and me, is because he is the creator of all things. But not only that, because he can write whatever story he wants to write for your life and my life, he doesn't need our approval, or as some people would tell us today, our forgiveness for the story he's writing for you, or the story he's writing for me. Daniel 4:35, Romans 9:20 and 21. God writes whatever story he wants to write. Now, that brings us back to the kind of author, the kind of God, the kind of story he's writing, and we're going to get into that in the days to come. But for what I want you to see right now is, what does this mean for your story? It means that as the creator, you belong to God, I belong to God, and God can write whatever story he wants to write for my life and your life. That's his prerogative as creator. And when we embrace these truths that we have here, you know what that's called? That's called the fear of the Lord. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, what's the problem with this way of thinking in our culture today that makes us even feel a little uncomfortable when we hear it? Well, we don't think in terms of the creator-creature category, do we? We don't think in those terms. Why don't we? Because of evolutionary theory. We may not believe in evolution, but you know what? Evolution has so unconsciously shaped us and formed us that we don't think in those terms. That is not a category typically at the forefront of our living. But not only that, because we don't think in terms of creator-creature categories, we buck against submitting to absolute authority, which a creator would have. And that really comes out of Western autonomy. You know, we are our own individual. And we determine who we are, what we're about, and where we're going. We determine our own purposes. And we submit to no one. We kind of, you know, that's kind of like the American rugged individual, you know. But that flies in the face of the idea of there being a creator. Because if there is a creator, then he has complete authority to which we must submit. But not only that, we struggle with a single outside power that defines reality and truth for us, the postmodern culture. We want to create our own truth. We want to create our own form our own foundation, whatever that might be. And the foundation I have today might be different tomorrow, and the truth I believe today might be different tomorrow. I have the right to determine. Don't take my rights away. God takes our rights away if he's the creator. And then lastly, we are uncomfortable with giving God such power, so we tend to live around the edge of God's story, don't we? And you know who that is? The average Christian man. We don't deny God's story, but we don't just jump into it. We live around the edge. And when we unconsciously embrace these ideas, you know what that is? We're acting as if there is no God. And if there is no God, then there's no story. And who says there's no story and there's no God? The fool. The fool. I love what Chuck Swindoll says in his book, Improving Your Serve. It kind of describes the typical average Christian man today as we kind of tiptoe around the edges of God's story. He says this: I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. Not enough to explode my soul or to disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a warm cup of milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough of him to make me love a black man or pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of the womb, not a new birth. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I love that phrase, that line. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. That's a man who acknowledges that there is a story that God is writing, but he just doesn't want to jump in with both feet. Whether you deny the story altogether or you won't jump into the story, you're living as if there is no God who is the creator of all things, who has complete authority over our lives. Which, if that's where you are and I am, it makes us no different than the one who says there is no God, because we're both living a foolish life that denies reality. And when you deny reality, sooner or later, you're going to bump into it. And when we do, we will experience pain. And so what have we seen? Two things. Story is important. Why? Because all of life comes to us as a story. Story is how we daily relate to each other. And story is how we make sense of life's events and circumstances. Secondly, we saw God is telling a story. It is a single account that explains all of reality. It is God's autobiography. Why? It's about him, and he's the one doing the writing, about his interaction with his creation as creator. And it's being perfectly written by a sovereign creator for his own purposes. It's a story about him in which he is the main character, not about us. We are important characters, but the story is not about us, it's about him. So here's my question. If story is important in the living of life, and if God is telling a story about the reality of life, then exactly where is the reality of God's story being told in the midst of life? Come back in 5 minutes, and we will give you that answer. We're back. We ended our first half with a question. If story is important in the living of life, we saw that it is. Life is all about story. God is writing a story. And if God is telling a story about the reality of life, what life is about and how we fit in it, then exactly where is the reality of God's story being told in the midst of life? And that's what we want to begin to focus on now. And that brings us to our third question for today. Where is God's story being told? Where is his story being told? We get a clue where his story is being told in Acts chapter 13. Paul is speaking to a group of Jews and Gentiles in the city of Antioch, which is over in Turkey, and he's giving them a history lesson. And what he in essence is saying in Acts 13 is this: God has been telling an unfolding story, I might add, right under your very noses, is what he's going to tell them, on the stage of human history. And unless you join in this story, you will miss out on what God is doing. That's in essence the message of Acts 13 in Paul's sermon to the people at Antioch. Now what I want to do is I want to go through just a few verses, and I don't want to read it all, because if we did, it's a long passage. But what I did is I just went through each verse and gave a summary statement, okay? So you might want to look at this later, see what it is, but let me just go through this in a quick form in summary statement. Verse 17a, Paul says to them, God chose Israel from all the people of the earth for his special purposes for the world. And remember in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, he begins to do his work specifically by calling Abraham. And through Abraham there would be a family which became the nation of what? Israel. And through Israel they would be a light to the Gentiles, in which God would bring his story to the entire world. So God began by choosing Israel from all the people of the earth. And remember, it wasn't because there was something good about them or they were wonderful and great. He says, I chose you because you were a nobody. God made Israel great during their stay in Egypt. Remember how he did that? Through Joseph, and then Joseph brought all his family there during the plague and all that, and everything became great. They became great as a people. And they became threatening, to the Israelite, or to the Egyptians. And so what happened? They began to put them in slavery. And God saw that, and God through who? Moses, verse 17c says, led them out of Egypt with an unusual display of his power. What was that unusual display of power? The 10 plagues, and then the crossing over of the Red Sea, in which he destroyed, so that they did not perish. They were there how long? 40 days. 40 days. That was Jesus in the wilderness. 40 years. And nothing wore out, and they had manna from heaven, water from the rocks. God provided everything they needed miraculously. Acts 13. Verse 19a, God destroyed the 7 nations in the land of Canaan. Remember, he was going to give them the promised land, and he brought them through the Jordan River, and the land was filled with giants and people who threatened them. And God destroyed the 7 nations in the promised land, it tells us. And while it was Israel that fought the battles, Israel wasn't just standing there passively and watching. God had Israel fight the battles, but it tells us that God was the one who triumphed over the nations. Verse 19b, God gave Israel the land of Canaan as an inheritance. Now, how could God do this? Weren't there people living there? Well, God could do it because it wasn't the Canaanites' land. Whose was it? It was God's land. And why was it God's land? Because God is the creator of everything, and everything that there is belongs to him. So it was his land to give. He made it, he owns it, it's his to give. Verse 20, God gave Israel its judges and rulers. He's getting into all the time, the Samuel and the prophets, all of that, where we see the prophets come and go. And as that happens, Israel grows as a nation. But what we see in verse 20 is Israel did not raise up themselves as a nation. It was God who raised them up. Verse 21 says that God gave to Israel Saul, its first king. It also tells us in verse 22 that God removed Saul as king. Verse 22b says that after God removes Saul as king, God raises up David as king. And who is David? The son of Jesse, a young shepherd. In other words, a nobody. It wasn't because of something great or wonderful about David. David was overlooked, but it was God who raised up David. Verse 23, God brought to Israel ultimately a Savior, Jesus, just as he promised, Paul says. God had planned and spoken of Jesus coming long ago, where? In the prophets, in the Old Testament, so that when it happened in the New Testament, we would know God was doing it, and not some other force or some other thing. Verse 24 and 25, Paul begins to talk about John the Baptist. John the Baptist's words, he says, show that Jesus is the center of God's story, not John or not anyone else. Verse 26, Paul says that God was behind the gospel message that was being sent out after planning and accomplishing that through Jesus Christ. In verse 27, he says, even people who did not know God or love God acted according to God's plan and promises. In other words, he's telling us that God directs all human history, whether men acknowledge him or whether men don't acknowledge him. God is writing the story. And God accomplishes his purposes even through those who do not know him and even through those who attempt to thwart him. Verse 29, what happened in the arrest, trial, and death of Jesus, Paul says, was not primarily the work of man, it was what? Primarily the work of God. It was God's plan being played out that he had planned long ago in Scripture. Acts 2:23 says this Jesus was delivered up, talking about to the cross, according to the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. Acts 4:28, they did what your power, that is those who crucified Jesus, did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. In other words, what Jesus says, you don't take my life from me, I lay it down on my own. Jesus was in control. Why? Because it was God's story that was being written, and nothing could thwart that. And finally, verse 30, Paul says, the story climaxes with God raising Jesus from the dead. And what he's telling us in this sermon here is that God has been work from the very beginning of human history all the way up to its climax in the resurrection, which makes the larger purpose of God's story possible. Now, the resurrection isn't the end of God's story, it's just the climax of it. It's what God is going to be able to now use to energize and to move forward the plot that he has to accomplish the purpose of restoring his good but broken creation. Without Jesus, without the resurrection, without the death, and without the resurrection, the plot and the purpose could not happen. And so here's my question. What is the one thing Acts 13 wants us to understand? Said a lot, but there's one thing, just one thing. Is what was the guy's name here?
Jack Palance.
Yeah, I know that. Well, what was the guy's name? Curly? Curly. What was the one thing Curly said? What's the one thing Paul wants us to know? What he wants us to know is this. God is at the center of all human history. Did you notice how it always is, God did this, and then God did this, and then God did this? In the beginning, God created. And all through human history, God did this, and God did this, and God did this, and God did this. God is at the center of all human history. He wants us to know that everything that happens in this world has to do with God, it is being directed by God, and it gets its principal meaning from God. Why? Because the author is the creator. He creates everything. Craig shared with me a thought I thought was really good. He creates not only the message, but he also creates the ink, the pen, and the parchment on which the message is going to be written. And the message is not the medium, it's not the ink, it's not the pen, it's not the parchment. If it was the ink, pen, and parchment, then the message could be limited. The message isn't dependent on them. It goes forth in spite of that. The message is the story that God is telling, told through creation, the ink, the pen, and the parchment. So if all that is true, then what does it tell us about human history? And more importantly, we're getting ahead here, what does it tell us about your history, about your story? Well, what it tells us about human history, it tells us this, is history is his story. History is his story. History is God's story. All of human history, from the beginning of time to its call to when it's completed, when Jesus comes and makes all things new. In other words, behind everything that happens in the world and in your life, without exception, in the world and in your life, is a larger story. And that larger story is being sovereignly orchestrated by a sovereign God who is the creator and owner of everything. In other words, the story has been planned before time. It's being told throughout human history. It's being told throughout the course of your life. And it's being directed in human history and in your own life towards God's good end. An end, a good end that Paul says we cannot even imagine the glory that will be revealed us someday for those who are part of the story. And to become part of the story through Jesus. And so, a summary of today, we asked 3 questions. What is God's story? Who is the author of God's story? And where is the story of God being told? The first question, what is God's story? We gave an answer that said it's an overarching narrative, a universal narrative, centered in God that gives everything an event in creation a cohesive meaning and purpose. Who is the author? He is the sovereign creator who is the source and owner of everything, determiner of reality, and director of world events and power. And where is it being told? It's being told in every person, circumstance, and event of human history, past, present, and future. It was being told in Abraham's life. It was being told in Moses' life. It was being told in David's life. It was being told in John Calvin's life, in Martin Luther's life. It was being told in your great-great-grandparents' life, your great-grandfather's life, your grandfather's life, your father's life, and in your life. And it will be told in your children's life and their children's life. It's told everywhere. Because everywhere is where the story is being told. And so let's bring this now to a conclusion, what we've said. 3 important things that we need to keep in mind as we move forward in this series, okay? First of all, we cannot escape creational reality. And again, by creational reality, I mean this. God has created the world. He's designed everything to function in a diverse way, according to a fixed order, that produces harmony and a sense of shalom that allows everything in creation, including you and I, to flourish and to thrive. And it brings God glory. We live in that creational reality. Now that creational reality was violated through sin, and we're now, the order has been disordered. Remember we saw last time the great disordering through our own refusal to submit to God as the creator. But we can't escape that reality no matter what. And as a result, because your life is sourced in God, you are His creation, created as a male image bearer, who is to steward his power not for your own sake, but for the sake and blessing of others and for the glory of God. And therefore your days on this earth are woven into human history, what God is doing in history. You are here not at an accidental time, but you are here for such a time as this. And for that reason, you and all your life events, me and all my life events and circumstances, are part of the reality of God's larger story, even if you are aware of it or not, and even if you believe it or not. We can't escape it. And when we try to escape it, whether it's I don't believe it, or I'm just not aware of it, or I'll just kind of tippy-toe around the edges of it, we live our lives not with wisdom, but with what? Foolishness. We're going against the current of reality. And when we do, pain is what you will feel when you bump into God's reality. This is how God wants us to live. And when we do, we will experience wisdom. Second thing we need to keep in mind as we go through this series. While we can't escape creational reality, you won't avoid the cultural pole. You and I will not avoid the cultural pole. Now, what do I mean by that? We live in a culture that has competing narratives. And so often those narratives are so much a part of our culture that it's just like breathing. It's just like, swimming in the water. You ask a fish, tell me what it means to be wet, and he will say, I don't know. It's so much a part of him that he is unaware of it. Well, there are competing narratives for God's story that surround us all the time, and they're pulling us. They're pulling us out of God's story. And they will influence us to think not in light of God's story, but in light of another story. One popular narrative that is just so central to secularism is this. God's story is really about religion, and your story, or the human story, is about reality. So you have religion and reality. It creates this dualism. And religion is all about the private life, your private life. Whereas reality is all about the public square. It's where we all live and life happens and all of that. The private life is the place for faith. But the public square is the place for what's real. You see what they've said? Faith isn't real, it's just kind of something you make up. And so you can keep that over there, but don't bring it into reality. Don't bring it into the public square. The message is this. Religion is nice, but it's not essential, so keep God in church and focus on what's important here. Now the sad thing is that we've kind of just accepted that. In one sense, the whole idea of church and state, it's kind of helped us we'll keep God in the church and we'll keep, the state over here. But where does life really happen according to our culture? Not at church. Churches aren't essential, are they? Other things are essential, but we can shut down church because the message is that's about faith and there's no real reality there. You can do without that and still live. You can't do without what's essential and still live. That's the pull of the culture. And it's telling us that God's story is not true. Pull out of it and live like this. And when you do, you no longer live in a wise life. Why? Because now you're going against the current of reality, and now you're going to be bumping into it, and that's a foolish thing to do. It's a foolish thing to do. But the culture says there is no God. At least, no place for God in the public square. So we can't avoid creational reality. You won't avoid the cultural pull. And thirdly, you and I mustn't neglect personal awareness. We mustn't neglect personal awareness. And here I want us to think just about your story and my story. What is your story when we talk about that? Well, most men are unaware of their story. And the reason is because we don't like to think about things really deeply, do we? It's easier just, anything that's going to create a little confusion or a little pain, or it's going to require a little energy or effort, we'll just avoid that and just kind of stay on the surface. And as long as I'm just kind of get along, I'm fine, I'm comfortable. That's another thing our culture has told us. Just be comfortable and compliant. And so we avoid thinking. And when you avoid thinking, you are not going to be aware of your story. You have to think deeply to understand your story, to know your story. Second reason why most men are unaware of their story is not only they avoid thinking, but they think wrongly about their story. They think wrongly about their story. And how we think wrongly about our story, guys, is we think that our story is simply the sum total of the events of our life and circumstances. It's like in that one of those first slides, it's all those puzzle pieces. Yeah, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and none of the dots are connected. And so when we tell our story, all we're telling our story is, well, here's one piece, and here's a blue piece, and here's a red piece, and here's a green piece of the puzzle. But none of them are put together. None of the dots are connected, and so they don't form a cohesive whole. But I can guarantee you that unconsciously you have connected the dots. And you are living a story, whether you realize it or not. And I can guarantee you this, that because we are fallen and we have an inherent allergy towards God, how we connect the story is never in line with God's larger story. It's always a story where I am the main character, I am the author, and I have to be the creator. And that kind of a story is a foolish story. Why? Because it says and it lives as if there is no God. And when we avoid thinking about our story, and we think wrongly about our story, and therefore we are unaware of our story, instead of our story moving forward in a linear fashion, it just kind of cycles around. And it's just like, why? I just seem to be stuck. I'm never going anywhere with my life. Everything just keeps happening over and over. Groundhog Day kind of a story, right? We are personally stuck. And you can tell if you're personally stuck in your story because we are unaware of what's driving unwanted emotion and behavior. Are there emotions that you exhibit? Is there behavior that you exhibit in your life? It's like, I just don't like that. I don't want that. But I don't know why it just keeps coming back. I don't want it, but here it is. What I want to do, I don't do. What I don't want to do, I do. Oh, wretched man that I am. Why is that? Well, you're unaware of your story. You're personally stuck because you will be unaware of what's preventing real transformation. You want to change, but you just never think that you can. Or no matter what you do, I check all the boxes, and yeah, I'm doing everything, but I just keep kind of circling back to who I've always been. And then you become cynical, and you lose hope. And like a lot of men, then you just kind of pull away, and you're gone for a little while, and then you say, well, I'll try it again. I'll come back to church, I'll come back to a men's group, and I'll come back to trying to do good again, do more, try harder. When that doesn't work, I'll walk away, come back. Guys, that's not forward movement, that's cyclical. That's a life going nowhere. And God's story that He wants us and He invites us to become part of is going somewhere wonderful. Thirdly, we're personally stuck because we are unable to bring our story into God's. We want to join God's story, we want to enter into it, but no matter what we do, we just kind of tippy-toe around the edge. We might put our finger in it and test it. It's kind of warm and nice, but we'll pull out. Why? Because we're stuck. And we're stuck because we have avoided thinking deeply about our lives, and we've thought wrongly about our lives. And as a result, we have no personal awareness of who we are as men, fallen men, made in the image of God, who have been formed and shaped by the story of our life. And when we live like this, again, the fool says in his heart, there is no God, or there's no larger story. Put another way, a more positive way, if you embrace creational reality, and if you fight back against the cultural pull, and if you work hard to cultivate personal awareness, then and only then will your story join in with God's story. That's what we're going to focus on in this series. And when you embrace creational reality, and when you and I fight back against the cultural pull, and when we work hard to understand what's going on inside us and how that affects our emotions and our actions and our reactions, then we'll begin to grow into the men that God created us to be in the greatest story ever told. And we will never grow into that man until we move forward in a story that has learned to join in with God's story. And so we'll begin this process April 10th, how God tells his story. And one of the things we're going to see, God tells his story not like we tell our story, because how we tell our story, what we just saw, we tell it in a way it just kind of cycles around. God tells his story in a linear forward movement. It's going someplace. It's not stuck. Nathan?
Thank you so much, Scott. Guys, did you appreciate that this morning? We are honored that you would take a break from your families, from your Saturday morning commitments to be here with us. And we really respect that. So we're going to end on time. Thanks to all those who joined us online. We saw your messages in the chat as you interacted with us. We are excited to see you guys next month. Thank you so much for being here. God bless you.